The return trip from Salt Lake City felt different. I had a purpose beyond just delivering my cargo. Every mile east was a mile closer to the starting point of my search. I dropped my load in a warehouse in Kentucky and picked up a new one heading for Georgia, a route that would take me right through the heart of Tennessee, not 30 miles from where I'd found the record. I felt a nervous energy, a mix of hope and the distinct possibility of disappointment. I timed my drive to arrive in the area on a Saturday, praying the flea market was a weekly affair. As I pulled off the interstate and onto that same narrow country road, my heart pounded a little faster. But as I rounded the final bend, my hopes sank. The dusty field was empty. There were no tents, no trucks, no people. Just a wide, vacant patch of grass with a few stray pieces of trash skittering in the wind. A deep sense of anticlimax washed over me. I parked the rig on the shoulder and walked out into the middle of the field, the silence even more profound than before. Had it been a one-time event? A traveling market that had moved on? I looked for any sign, any poster or notice, but there was nothing. It was as if the picker's paradise had been a mirage, a dream I'd had. Dejected, I climbed back in my cab. My one lead had evaporated. I sat there for a while, the engine idling, listening to the silence. I could just get back on the highway, continue my run to Georgia, and let the mystery remain a mystery. But the thought of quitting after coming this far felt like a betrayal, not just of my own quest, but of the music itself. Jedediah Stone deserved more than to be forgotten. I thought back to my conversation with the vendor. Got this whole crate from an estate sale over in the next county. It was a vague clue, but it was all I had. I pulled out my road atlas, the paper pages worn and soft from years of use. I was in Williamson County. The next county over could mean any of a half-dozen places. I decided to start with the closest. I picked a small town on the map, a place with a name that sounded like it had been around for a while. Thompson's Station. It was a long shot, a complete stab in the dark, but it was better than giving up. For the next few hours, I became a different kind of traveler. I wasn't a long-haul trucker anymore. I was a detective. I found a place to park the rig on the outskirts of the town and walked into its small, historic center. It was a quiet place, with a quaint main street lined with brick buildings from the turn of the century. My first stop was a small antique shop. An elderly woman with kind eyes looked up from a crossword puzzle as I entered, a small bell on the door announcing my arrival. I felt awkward, out of my element. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. I described the record, the plain cover, the name Jedediah Stone. I asked if she knew of any estate sales in the area recently, or if the name meant anything to her. She listened patiently, her head tilted. "Jedediah Stone," she murmured, tasting the name. "It has a familiar ring to it, like a name from the past, but I can't quite place it. We get so many things through here, so many stories. I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you." It was the same story at the town's small library and at a hardware store that had been in the same family for 3 generations. People were kind, willing to listen, but the name drew only blank stares or vague, unhelpful flickers of recognition. I was chasing an echo, a name that had all but faded from memory. Dejected, I climbed back in my cab. My one lead had evaporated. I sat there for a while, the engine idling, listening to the silence. I could just get back on the highway, continue my run to Georgia, and let the mystery remain a mystery. But the thought of quitting after coming this far felt like a betrayal, not just of my own quest, but of the music itself. Jedediah Stone deserved more than to be forgotten. I thought back to my conversation with the vendor. Got this whole crate from an estate sale over in the next county. It was a vague clue, but it was all I had. I pulled out my road atlas,
the paper pages worn and soft from years of use. I was in Williamson County. The next county over could mean any of a half-dozen places. I decided to start with the closest. I picked a small town on the map, a place with a name that sounded like it had been around for a while. Thompson Station. It was a long shot, a complete stab in the dark, but it was better than giving up. For the next few hours, I became a different kind of traveler. I wasn't a long-haul trucker anymore. I was a detective. I found a place to park the rig on the outskirts of the town and walked into its small, historic center. It was a quiet place with a quaint main street lined with brick buildings from the turn of the century. My first stop was a small antique shop. An elderly woman with kind eyes looked up from a crossword puzzle as I entered, a small bell on the door announcing my arrival. I felt awkward, out of my element. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. I described the record, the plain cover, and the name Jedediah Stone. I asked if she knew of any estate sales in the area recently, or if the name meant anything to her. She listened patiently, her head tilted. "Jedediah Stone," she murmured, tasting the name. "It has a familiar ring to it, like a name from the past, but I can't quite place it. We get so many things through here, so many stories. I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you." It was the same story at the town's small library and at a hardware store that had been in the same family for 3 generations. People were kind, willing to listen, but the name drew only blank stares or vague, unhelpful flickers of recognition. I was chasing an echo, a name that had all but faded from memory. Feeling defeated, I walked into the town's only diner for a cup of coffee before heading back to my truck. It was a classic small-town spot with red vinyl booths and a long Formica counter. I sat at the counter, and the waitress, a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, poured me a coffee without me having to ask. As I stirred my coffee, feeling the frustration build, I decided to try one last time. I told her the same story I'd told everyone else. I described the album, The Lonesome Road. She paused, the coffee pot in her hand. "Jedediah Stone," she said slowly. "My goodness, I haven't heard that name in 30 years. My head snapped up. "You know him?" She said, "I didn't know him well. He wasn't from right here. He was from up in the hills, further east. A quiet man, kept to himself mostly. But he made a bit of a stir for a while. Used to come down and play at the old VFW hall on a Saturday night sometimes. Just him and his guitar. My heart was racing. What happened to him?" She sighed, a sad, wistful sound. "Oh, honey, that's a sad story. He had the voice of an angel, a broken one, but an angel all the same. Wrote all his own songs. People said he was going to be the next Hank Williams. A record man from Nashville even came out to see him once." She shook her head, "but he had a darkness in him, a sadness he couldn't shake. And he had a wife, Elspeth, who he adored more than life itself. When she passed away from a fever, well, part of him passed away with her." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a genuine sorrow. After that, the music just stopped. He sold his guitar, they said, just disappeared back into the hills. Nobody heard from him again. He died some years back, lived a hard life, and died alone. She pointed with the coffee pot toward an old man sitting in a booth by the window reading a newspaper. "You want to know more, you should talk to Walter. He runs the co-op. He grew up in those same hills. He might know the whole story." I looked over at the man. He was old, his face a road map of wrinkles. I had found it. After all the dead ends, the echo was finally leading me to the source. I thanked the waitress, leaving a $10 bill on the counter for a $1 coffee, and walked toward the old man's booth. The story of Jedediah Stone was about to unfold.
Walter looked up from his newspaper as I approached, his eyes a pale, clear blue. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a lot of time looking at distant horizons. I introduced myself, explained that I was a trucker passing through, and told him I had come across an old record by a man named Jedediah Stone. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Jed Stone? Well, I'll be. Where in the world did you find that? I told him about the flea market, the dusty crate, the $2 purchase. He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Sounds about right. Jed never cared much for money. He gestured to the seat opposite him. Sit down, son. It's been a long time since anyone asked about Jedediah. For the next hour, over refills of coffee, Walter painted a picture of a man I had only known through his music. His stories filled in the haunting outlines that the waitress had sketched. Jed wasn't just a quiet man, Walter began. He was still, like a deep pool of water. You knew there was a lot going on underneath, but the surface was calm. We grew up together, up in the hollows. Back then, there wasn't much to do but work, hunt, and make your own entertainment. And for Jed, that was music. He got an old, beat-up guitar from a traveling preacher and taught himself to play. And the songs, they just poured out of him. It wasn't something he learned. It was something he was. Walter described a life of hardship and simple beauty. Jedediah worked small farms, logged timber, and did whatever he could to get by. But his real life began when he picked up his guitar. He wrote about the things he knew, the bite of the morning frost, the ache in his back from a long day's work, the beauty of the dogwood blossoms in the spring, the sorrow of a failed crop. He never wrote a song to be famous, Walter said, his voice firm. He wrote a song to get the feeling out. If he was sad, he'd write a sad song. If he felt a moment of joy, he'd write that too. His music was as honest as the dirt on his hands. The record, Walter explained, was the result of a brief, flickering brush with the outside world. A small-time record producer from Nashville heard about him through the grapevine and drove out to the hills. He was captivated by Jedediah's raw talent. This fella, he brought a portable recording machine, set it right in Jed's little cabin. That's why you can hear the crickets in the train whistle on the record. It's real. They recorded for 2 nights straight. Jed just played his songs, one after another. That record, The Lonesome Road, that was the result. They pressed a couple hundred copies, hoping to use it to get him a real record deal in Nashville. But Jedediah's heart wasn't in Nashville. His heart was with his wife, Elspeth. Elspeth, he said, his gaze drifting toward the window. She was his anchor. She understood his quietness, his moods. She was the one bright, steady light in his life. He wrote his best songs for her, even the sad ones. When she died, the light went out. It was a sickness that came on fast. One week she was fine, the next she was gone. The trip to Nashville to promote the record was scheduled for the week after her funeral. Jedediah never went. He told the record man to keep the records, to do what he wanted with them. He didn't care. The music was tied to everything he'd lost. To sing those songs was to feel that pain all over again. He sold his guitar to a man in the next town for $50. He gave the money to the church, and that was it. He just stopped. He lived out the rest of his days in that same little cabin, working the land, as silent as the stones in the creek bed. Walter fell silent, lost in the memory. I finally understood the source of the profound sadness in Jedediah's voice. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a story of immense talent and devastating loss. The Lonesome Road wasn't just a metaphor for a trucker's life. It was the path he had walked every day after losing his wife. "Where is he now?" I asked quietly. "Where is he buried?" Walter gave me a sad smile. "He's up in the hills, on the land he worked his whole life, next to Elspeth. There's a small, unmarked stone for him. He never wanted a fuss." He then drew me a map on a napkin, his hand surprisingly steady. It was a map to the old Stone property, to the cabin,
to the final resting place of the man who had become my constant companion. As I left the diner, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. I held the napkin in my hand. It felt heavier than any road atlas. I had started this journey looking for the story behind the music, and now I had found it. It was a story of love, loss, and silence. A story that was far more poignant and powerful than I could have ever imagined. My trip to Georgia could wait. I had one more stop to make.
Following Walter's hand-drawn map was like traveling back in time. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel eventually narrowed into a dirt track that wound its way deep into the rolling wooded hills. I had to leave my rig at a small country church and walk the last mile. The air was clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was so quiet you could hear the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a mourning dove. The cabin was just as Walter had described it. A small, weathered structure sitting in a clearing, its wood bleached gray by decades of sun and rain. It was dilapidated but still standing, a stubborn testament to the man who built it. I peeked through a grimy window. It was empty inside, save for a simple wooden table and a stone fireplace. This was where that incredible music was born, in this small, silent room. Behind the cabin, under the shade of a massive ancient oak tree, were two simple field stone markers, half overgrown with moss and ivy. One for Elspeth, one for Jedediah. There were no dates, no epitaphs, just their names, side by side for eternity. I stood there for a long time, the record tucked under my arm. It felt like I was bringing a piece of him home. I wasn't sad. The story was tragic, yes, but standing there in the profound peace of that place, I felt a sense of closure. The loneliness in his music was real, born of a heartbreak I could barely imagine. But his talent, the beauty he created out of his pain, was just as real. And it hadn't disappeared. It was here, in my hands. I didn't know what to do with it. My first thought, months ago, was that a musician this good deserved to be famous. I imagined bringing the record to some big shot in Nashville, of seeing Jedediah Stone's name in lights, of his story being told in magazines. But now that all felt wrong. It felt like a violation of his memory. He had turned his back on that world for a reason. His music wasn't for the charts or the critics. It was for him, for Elspeth, for the people in the VFW hall, and for anyone who understood the language of the Lonesome Road. I drove away from those hills with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just a fan of the music anymore. I felt like its custodian. It was a legacy entrusted to me by a $2 transaction in a dusty field. My life on the road continued. I still spent countless hours watching the world go by through my windshield. But something had changed. The loneliness was still there, a constant companion, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with the sound of Jedediah's voice, a voice that was now a friend's. His music had given my solitary life a secret, profound meaning. I decided against taking the record to a Nashville producer. Instead, on my next trip through the area, I made a stop. There's a small independent radio station in a town called Franklin, just south of Nashville. They play a mix of classic country, bluegrass, and folk, the kind of music that's about storytelling, not hit-making. I walked in, a middle-aged trucker in a place filled with young aspiring musicians, and asked to speak to the station manager. I told him a shortened version of the story and handed him a high-quality digital copy I'd made of the album. I didn't ask for money or recognition. I just made one request. Play it late at night, I said, for the other drivers, for the people who are still out there on the road when the world has gone to sleep. That's who it's for. He promised he would. I don't know if he ever did. I hope so. I like to imagine a fellow trucker, bleary-eyed and tired, rolling through the dark Tennessee hills and hearing that raw voice and that honest guitar come crackling through the speakers. I like to think that maybe for a few minutes it would make their own Lonesome Road feel a little less lonely. As for me, I still have the original record. It's my most prized possession. Sometimes when I'm home, I'll pour a glass of whiskey, put the needle down, and let the ghost and the grooves fill the silent house. I'm out on I-40 right now, heading west as the sun bleeds across the horizon. The cassette is in the player, and Jedediah is singing about the desert sky. The road still has its rhythm, the steady hum and vibration I've known my whole life. But now it feels less like a metronome and more like a harmony. I'm still just a man in a truck watching the miles go by. But now, I'm no longer just hauling freight. I'm carrying a story. I'm the keeper of a flame. And for a long-haul trucker, that's a cargo worth carrying.